Hello, I'm Robert, and this time I'm going to talk about Joseph Carroll's ingenious method of getting an experiment in low gravity and artificial gravity for free on the way up to the ISS. And all you need for this experiment is you add the weight of the tether and whatever you need by way of extra supplies for the crew if they're going to do this for a long time rather than just going straight up to the ISS. A short experiment, and all you need to do is add the weight of the tether. There's no extra fuel needed. So it's a very clever solution. And just before and I'll also talk a little bit more about other things to do with tether that weren't covered in my article. And all this is to do, in case you're coming in this for the first time you're coming in on all this, and this is to do with solving the problems of zero gravity and finding out about low gravity. And there are many quite serious problems with zero gravity which I won't enumerate. You can just follow the links and find out, but they are bad enough so that some doctors think that the life expectancy of a human being in space might be as low as 2 years. It might be or even less, so uncomfortably low, so that if you went on an interplanetary flight you very probably wouldn't survive it. And so it seems to be quite important to sort this out before attempting interplanetary flights, because I think you just might be able to get to Venus in less than that, but that's pushing it anyway, because it could possibly even quite less, and you come back from your long interplanetary flight quite possibly quite ill at the end of it if you did survive. And then for low gravity, then nobody knows what effect low gravity would have on human beings. So would you have normal life expectancy, or would you have a very short life expectancy, such as seems to be the case for zero gravity, or would it be somewhere in between the two? I mean, for instance, if your life expectancy is 20 or 30 in low gravity, that wouldn't be very good. And it's also possible that children wouldn't be able to grow in low gravity. Maybe their bones wouldn't grow, and maybe fetuses wouldn't be able to develop normally in low gravity either, and maybe it wouldn't be possible to have pregnancy in low gravity. So all these things are just not known. And this would be a way of getting a few extra data points on both low gravity and artificial gravity as well, because we don't know the effects on the human body of this. Certain things about artificial gravity to do with the spinning and the way it works is not quite the same as ordinary gravity or as any of the experiments we can do on the Earth. So you can read my article to find out more about all this. But here I just want to talk about, and you have the two ways of artificial gravity. I'm going to give two talks, one on short-arm tether, the actual practicalities now, talking about the actual practicalities of maybe doing these experiments in space. But this time I'm going to talk about the possibility of a tether experiment, a very simple tether experiment we could do, using the Soyuz on a normal supply mission to the ISS. Because the only tether experiment we have is the Gemini 11 and 12, when they only managed a very, very small amount. It was so little that you couldn't feel anything, you just saw something very slowly dropping in the artificial gravity. So we have no data points here for tether experiments in space. So his ingenious idea is that first of all you need to understand how the Soyuz gets to the ISS. So there's the final stage, and it separates from the final stage. It then has to boost from the separation point until it reaches the ISS orbit. So it has extra fuel already in order to get up to the ISS from the point at which it separates from the upper stage. So Joseph Carroll's ingenious idea is to attach a tether between the upper stage and the Soyuz module. And so before it starts to boost to the ISS, instead of boosting directly in the way it would to the ISS, instead it boosts in order to turn set the entire tether system spinning. So it uses the fuel that it would normally take to get up to the ISS to set itself and the booster spinning about its common center of gravity. And then you can do all the experiments you want. So you can, once it's set spinning, there's no extra fuel needed to keep it spinning. So You could slowly push it up. You could start off with very slow spin rates and try and test the effects of slow spin rates and low gravity. And if you can make it so that you can pull tether in and out, then you could also experiment with different lengths of tether and different spin rates. And then you can speed it up, and you could do a little bit more acceleration around, spin it a bit more, and then you could try faster spin rates all the way out and high levels of gravity, and find out at what level human beings become uncomfortable if they do. And you could try acclimatizing. One thing you can't do with this experiment is to slow down the spin rate at a particular tether length, because that would be wasting fuel. But you have to continually be increasing the spin rate. So if you want to test a low spin rate at a particular tether length, you would have to do that early in the experiment. And then finally, when all the experiments are over, and this could last, he's just talking about a short-term experiment, but it could become just routine, that this is the way that you do all the launches of the Soyuz to the ISS, that you always do these experiments on the way up. And these could also, by the way, possibly help the astronauts with adapting, using a regime in between full gravity and zero gravity, because astronauts have trouble adapting to zero gravity, and they experience nausea in zero gravity when they first go into space, what the so-called space sickness. And so, by the way, when they talk about the spin experiments, that maybe you'd experience nausea in spin, in artificial gravity, but you do experience nausea in zero gravity. So it wouldn't be too surprising, and you might be able to get over it. So if you do start experiencing nausea in low gravity as well. But anyway, so they could do these experiments on the way out to the ISS. Now, when the time comes, this is the very ingenious part of it, is when the time comes to finish the experiment, all you do is you release the tether, but you release it, you've got to choose exactly the right moment in the spin to release the tether. And if you choose exactly the right moment, then you recover all the delta V that you gained by spinning round and round and round. Because you are spinning, it's got quite a high velocity perpendicular to the center of mass of your tether system. And so that's the delta V that you've built up as you increase the spinning. And then if you break the tether at exactly the right moment, that delta V will be in exactly the right vector that you need to get to the ISS orbit. So it's just as if you were continuously accelerating to the ISS. And what's more, again, completely for free, you get a controlled re-entry of the booster stage as well. Because you can choose when to do this, when the ISS and you are in just the right position so as to send the booster where you want it to get controlled re-entry on the Earth, and you go up to the ISS. And you haven't used any fuel at all for this experiment, because you've just used fuel that you would need to use anyway to get to the ISS. It's also very safe, because this experiment isn't done anywhere near the ISS. So some people have objected to this, saying, oh, but the NASA will never permit us to do experiments like this near the ISS. And indeed, it probably would be quite difficult to get permission to do a tethered experiment near the ISS, but you aren't anywhere near the ISS when you're doing this. You're in a different orbit, a different orbital period, and you're at a different altitude. So this is a very, very ingenious idea. So now I just thought I'd finish by talking about a couple of other ideas to do with tethers, which I don't think are very widely known, which do change some of your ideas about using tethers. So for instance, one of the drawbacks that's often given for a tether system travelling, for instance, to Mars, is what happens when you get to Mars. And it's usually thought of as that you would have to, because you want to decelerate into Mars orbit, then you, if you are wanting to go into Mars orbit and not just do a flyby, there's the free return flyby, such as the double Athena, and in-space Mars, where you have hardly any course correction at all. The other idea is where you might want to go into orbit around Mars, and even a Mars capture orbit, you would still have to do some change of delta V in order to get into the Mars capture orbit. That's the one for my favourite one of my favourite first missions to Mars, to go into Mars capture orbit, and then do telepresence operation of avatars and robots on the surface of Mars. But anyway, whatever your mission there, there's always this objection that when you get to Mars, what you're going to do about your tether, because you're going to have to cut your tether, they thought, in order to decelerate. Well, and then you're stuck in 0G for the rest of your trip back as well, or else how do you get your tether back? How do you get your booster back again? You'd have to use up extra fuel to capture it. Well, it turns out that you don't need to cut the tether in order to do maneuvers. And very simple is that you can just boost along, if you just boost along the direction, if you have the thing orbiting, the tether spinning at right angles to the direction you're going, and if you just boost along it, then that's very straightforward. It just becomes like a sort of slight tenter arrangement thing. But you can boost in any direction so long as you just need to choose your rocket, the amount of the force and the direction, such as to both maintain the tether and do the change that you want to do. And for instance, I just need careful thought as to how you do it, and you might need to do this in short bursts at the right time when you're spinning around and things like that. So that's the idea that that your vehicles are not so hard, impossible to maneuver. And in the same way, if you have a tethered spacecraft spinning around in low Earth orbit, there's a problem of what you do about debris, because the ISS sometimes has to maneuver to avoid other spacecraft and bits of debris in low Earth orbit. If it's a big bit of debris, you would be able to maneuver to avoid it, just as the ISS does. If it's a small bit of debris, like micrometeorites, then you have the Hoy tether. And the Hoy tether is the idea of basically, you can imagine if you have lots and lots of cables joining your two habitats together, then that reduces the chance that any one of them is hit by a micrometeorite and cut. But with the Hoy tether, you also have them cross-linked to each other, so you have more like almost like a chain or like a net kind of effect, chain link net kind of effect, or a bit like chain armor in the old days. This sort of idea of something that you just break one chain, one link, and it's not going to, and the whole thing isn't going to come apart. And so that's the idea of a Hoy tether, and it's surprisingly lightweight. I think it was about 1 ton, 1.5 tons for 500 kilometers. For a kind of for one of his experiments he was looking at. He wasn't looking at artificial gravity. He was looking at the momentum exchange spinning tether thing. I could talk about another talk, or you can look it up. It's a way of making it much easier to requiring less delta V to get into orbit. Then you get extra spin, which then sends you off on your interplanet. Extra delta V sends you off on the other side of the tether, which sends you off into interplanetary space. But for tether in orbit, in order to get artificial gravity, you're talking about something much shorter than that. And depending on the spin rates you're tolerating, if it was say 3 RPMs, I think it depends on the artificial gravity as well. I'll put figures into, I'm going to make this into an article, I'll put all the figures into the article, but you're talking about maybe 100 meters, a couple hundred meters. It could be as short as 10 or 20 meters, depending on what human beings can tolerate and what level of artificial gravity you're planning to generate. Whether, for instance, Mars gravity is okay, and there's no way we can design it around any particular figures there, because we don't have any figures yet as to what's needed for human beings to stay healthy in space. So we simply can't design it, we need the experiments. But so that's the Hoy tether idea, and eventually he has the idea of like a big tube of these things. And you could also have multiple Hoy tethers, so in the very remote case that if you have, say, 2 or 3 Hoy tethers, once you first one to get it going, and then you put other ones across. So that if one of them does, in a very remote case, get damaged by a very large bit of debris that somehow you don't manage to maneuver to avoid, then you'd have spare ones which once you've been up there for a while, you can easily send up spare Hoy tethers from time to time, and then you string that across to replace it and take it in and repair it if you can. So it does seem to me that the problem of debris in space is no longer really a problem once you use Hoy tethers, and once you've got the possibility of manoeuvring. So those are two extra things I wanted to add in, that you can manoeuvre with when you've got a tethered space station, just as you can a rigid space station, and that the tethers do not need to be vulnerable to micrometeorites, no more vulnerable than spacecraft is anyway. And then once you have this tether between your two things, then I've talked about this a bit in my other article. I found out that Joseph Carrol has already talked about this in the past, that you could have, for instance, elevators going between the two, and it goes into the engineering. If it's a very long one, if it's hundreds of meters, then you might want a way of getting very quickly from one to the other. And you can't do a spacewalk because, of course, the spinning effect is going to make it very difficult to do spacewalks. You'd have to need very powerful motors to get it from one to the other. But you have an elevator going between the two, and you can have a zero-G module as well in the middle, where the two join up. So it doesn't mean that you know that you an end to zero-G habitats in space. You can have as much zero-G as you like, so you could have something like the ISS, and if you need a zero-G laboratory in space, make 9/10 of it zero-G and have the sleeping compartments only in these spinning tethered part of it. But I think working into detail, and then you could also have, once you've got these tubes between the two, there's the idea you could actually extend the living space at the two ends with using the tubes and putting thicker walls around the tubes at the bottoms of the tubes at both ends. And that could make a very easy way of extending the living space. With this tether, it would be pressurised, obviously air in between, pressurised outside by the air, and it could be quite strong, even though it is just a tether system, and you can add some thick, clear plastic, such as they would use for greenhouses on the moon, and very strong, thick plastic around the inside, and create greenhouse habitats. And you would even have, maybe, once you've got lots of water sent up into space, then you could have water for shielding. Once you have big Falcon Heavies sending multiple tons of stuff into space, then you could have water for shielding and get completely shielded from cosmic radiation, and maybe even water for a swimming pool, swimming being very good exercise in space. Anyway, I think this is time to stop. My videos are quite short. Hopefully I managed to fit all that into 30 minutes. And I'm planning to write this up into one of my articles. And also doing this as practice leading up to, I'm going to be talking on the space show, so David Livingstone, Dr. Space's space show in 14th of March, Friday 14th of March, about some of these topics.